So everybody knows that US President Donald Trump announced a whack ton of tariffs on pretty much every country on the planet, and everybody was sort of debating what that would do to the economy. Well, the latest data from the labor market just came out, and we're beginning to have some answers. These are the latest data updates that came out about the US labor market, and what we're beginning to see is basically weakness in the labor market, a much more tepid labor market. On the right, you see the unemployment rate basically creeping up, and as a reflection of that, we see on the left a very subdued change in payrolls. Now, the left graph basically shows how many new jobs were added, because every single month we assume that people are going to be changing jobs. Maybe unemployed people are suddenly getting jobs again, so that number changes. But by and by, the net of that, how many net jobs are added, that's basically a good measure of the strength and resilience of the labor market. And what we've seen now is basically 4 straight months of below 100,000 payrolls added per month. That's actually the weakest stretch since the beginning of the pandemic. And it's basically a red flag that the economy is a little bit nervous. So if you do the math and crunch numbers, well, 4 months of subdued payrolls takes us back to, well, April, when Donald Trump first released his tariff plan. And that's because firms are basically a little bit jittery about the tariffs. So they're cutting costs ahead of time. They're freezing hiring, for instance. They might even be laying people off as a result. Now, you might be thinking, how come we don't really see any change in inflation? Because inflation today is still at 2.7%, which is fairly modest. So, number one, it takes time for inflation, for basically firms to adapt and then feed things back into inflation. Inflation takes time. Second, a lot of these firms have actually been eating the costs themselves, first of all. So they haven't actually put forward the prices to consumers yet. They haven't raised prices significantly to capture the cost incurred from the tariffs. But what is far more immediate as an indicator, and therefore possibly more telling as an indicator, is how firms are reacting in the US labor market. And what we're beginning to see is, again, we're creeping up to 4 months of possibly below 100,000 payroll ads per month. And that translates to a lot of hiring freezes. And if hiring isn't even picking up, then chances are wages won't be picking up either. So all in all, we're seeing a not so rosy picture of how the labor market is reacting, and namely by cooling down and by weakening. And that tells us that we're going to see some stagnation in terms of wages and in terms of hiring.